Welcome to 5-Minute Family Law. This episode is the first in a series of episodes about parenting after separation. When parents separate, they have to answer a bunch of really important questions about things like where will the children mostly live? How will the children's time be divided between their parents, and will anybody else have time with them? And how do the parents decide important issues in the children's lives, like where will they go to school? If they get sick, how do they get treated? What extracurricular activities will they participate in? Under both the Federal Divorce Act and the Provincial Family Law Act, the first and only consideration parents and judges and arbitrators are supposed to take into account when making decisions about things like this are the children's best interests. This episode is about the children's best interests under those two pieces of legislation. The Divorce Act only applies to parents who are married. It talks about parenting after separation in terms of spouses who have parenting time with their children and decision-making responsibility for their children, and people who aren't spouses who might have contact with a child. Under Section 7.1 of the Divorce Act, a person who has parenting time or decision-making responsibility or contact is required to exercise that parenting time, decision-making responsibility, or contact in a manner that is consistent with the best interests of the child. The first part of Section 16 of the Act is addressed to the court. It says that the court shall take into consideration only the best interests of the child when making decisions about parenting time, decision-making responsibility, or contact. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but how do you decide what course of action is or is not in the best interests of a child? What does best interests really mean? And for that, you have to read the rest of Section 16. So by now, you can probably guess that if you're in court arguing about parenting arrangements under the Divorce Act, you need to read Section 16 and read it carefully. So let's carry on. Subsection 2 says that when considering the factors referred to in subsection 3, and those are the best interest factors that we'll get to in a second, the court shall give primary consideration to the child's physical, emotional, and psychological safety, security, and well-being. So even though the only consideration is the best interests of the child, there are these three primary considerations that have to do with the child's safety, security, and well-being. So moving on to subsection 3. This section provides a list of factors that relate to the circumstances of the child that are important when making decisions about the course of action that's in the child's best interests. And they include, among other things, the child's needs given the child's age and stage of development, the nature and strength of the child's relationship with each spouse and other important people in the child's life, each spouse's willingness to support the development and maintenance of the child's relationship with the other spouse, the history of the care of the child's views and preferences, and a whole bunch of other factors. Among other things, subsection 3 also asks the court and parents and arbitrators to consider any family violence and its impact on the ability and willingness of a person who engaged in the family violence to care for and meet the needs of the child, and the appropriateness of making an order that would require persons to cooperate on issues affecting the child. Now, we can't stop there because Section 16, sub 4, has a bunch of additional factors that need to be considered when family violence is present. So subsection 16, sub 4 says, in considering the impact of family violence under subsection 3, the court shall take the following into account: the nature, seriousness, and frequency of the family violence and when it occurred, whether there is a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in relation to a family member, whether the family violence is directed toward the child or whether the child is directly or indirectly exposed to family violence, the physical, emotional, and psychological harm or risk of harm to the child, and it continues for a number of other factors. So those are, roughly speaking, the factors that the court takes into account under the Divorce Act when it's thinking about the decision that is in the best interests of the child. And under Section 7.1, it's not just the court that has to consider this, but also spouses and anybody else who happens to have contact with the child. The Family Law Act, on the other hand, applies to everyone. It applies to parents who are married, as well as to parents who live together in a long-term unmarried relationship, parents that dated, and to parents that neither dated nor ever lived together. The Family Law Act talks about parenting after separation in terms that are very similar to what we find under the Divorce Act. It talks about guardians who have parenting time with children and guardians who exercise parental responsibility for making decisions about children. And it talks about people that aren't guardians who may have contact with a child. Under the first subsection in section 37 of the Act, it says that when parents or the court are making orders or agreements about parenting after separation, they must consider the best interests of the child only. Subsection 2 has a long list of factors, a lot like what we see in Section 16 of the Divorce Act, that spell out some specific circumstances that the court and parents and arbitrators should take into account when making decisions about what's in the best interests of children. They include the children's health and emotional well-being, the views of the children, the nature and strength of the relationship between the children and significant persons in the children's lives, the history of the child's care, the child's need for stability, the ability of each person to exercise parental responsibilities, parenting time, or contact, as well as the impact of any family violence on the child's safety, security, or well-being, whether the family violence is directed toward the child or toward another family member. Now, under the Divorce Act, when family violence was a factor under Section 16 sub 3, you then turned to Section 16 sub 4 to look at the additional factors to assess the impact of the family violence. Under the Family Law Act, when family violence is a factor under Section 37 sub 2, you turn to a different section altogether, Section 38, for the factors that relate to family violence. And those factors include, much like the Divorce Act, the nature and seriousness of the family violence, how recently the family violence occurred, the frequency of the family violence, whether any psychological or emotional abuse constitutes or is evidence of a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior directed at a family member, whether the family violence was directed toward the child, whether the child was exposed to family violence that was not directed towards the child, and a few other factors that are really important. And so, if you're in court or before an arbitrator arguing about parenting after separation under the Family Law Act, you really want to read sections 37 and 38 very carefully. And so, those are the factors and considerations that are involved in determining the best interests of a child under the Divorce Act and the Family Law Act. Before we go, however, I just want to make a few general remarks. By now, pretty much everyone recognizes that when you're in front of an arbitrator or a judge arguing about parenting after arrangements after separation, that really the only thing worth talking about is the child's best interests. And that's important because it's what the statutes require. But what's really important to appreciate is that neither the Family Law Act nor the Divorce Act are about the rights or entitlements of parents. If they're about anybody's rights, they're about the rights of children. It's the child's right to a meaningful and loving relationship with a parent. And it's about the child's right to be competently raised and nurtured into becoming a functioning adult who is a contributing member of society. And so please read Section 16 of the Divorce Act and Sections 37 and 38 of the Family Law carefully. You'll see that there's nothing in there about the intrinsic rights of parents to parenting time or decision-making responsibility. What they're all about are the enormous constellation of factors and circumstances that go into making decisions that are genuinely about the best interests of the child. And so, if you're ever in front of me arguing about parenting arrangements, I don't want to hear, because it's in the best interest of a child, sort of tacked on to every third sentence as a kind of slogan. What I want to hear about is that you have a cultural, linguistic, or an ethnic background which forms an important part of the child's identity. I want to hear about your close and loving relationship with the child and how it's important for the child's well being to be with you on a regular basis. I want to know that your child has special needs and that among those special needs are a need for stability and predictability in the child's life that you in particular are better able to meet. Those are the factors I want to hear about. I want to hear about the quality and nature of your relationship, the things that you bring to the table. It's not enough just to toss off best interests of the child like it's a slogan, because that's not going to have the impact that you need it to have. You really want to think about this from the child-centered perspective that the Family Law Act and the Divorce Act adopt. It really is about children's rights. It's not about yours. It's about theirs.